My name is Jack Meyer. I'm an interviewer for the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. I'm interviewing Mr. Dick Soike on November 30th of 2006 at the Wyoming Branch Library. Our camera operator today is Diane Reif. Also present today is his wife, Mrs. Margaret Soike, also a World War II veteran. Dick, we really appreciate your coming in and sharing your story of your experiences. If you would start out by telling a little bit about your early years, how you entered the military service, how you chose the Navy, where you trained a little bit, and then some of the major incidents that occurred while you were on active duty.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jack. Well, I was born in 1923 in Minneapolis, but actually, because of health concerns of my mother, around 1930, I moved to Long Beach, California. And that was a very fortuitous change of locale. At that time, the economy of Long Beach, California was based on three things. One, the discovery of oil in Signal Hill. Two, the wonderful climate, which attracted both summer and winter tourists. And three, and maybe even more importantly, it was the home port for a large portion of the Pacific Fleet. The two real aircraft carriers that we had at that time, the Lexington and the Saratoga, were anchored when they were in the Pacific coast. They would be anchored right offshore in Long Beach. Some of the battleships, some of the cruisers. I think the destroyers largely were down in San Diego, but we had enough of the big fellows right at our doorstep there. And it turned out that a lot of the youngsters I went to school with were the children of officers and enlisted men who were assigned to these ships. And I kept hearing in the mid-1930s, when the Japanese were marauding in Manchuria and raising Cain in China too, that, boy, someday the United States is going to have to fight the Japanese. Well, I didn't think too much of it at the time, but I thought, well, gee, we've had enough wars in this century, there's no need to have another one. Well, I graduated from high school in 1940, and that, of course, was another banner year in the history of the 20th century. The war in Europe had really escalated from the so-called phony war of the 1939s in the 1940, when Hitler's blitzkrieg took over Poland and invaded the lowlands of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And we had the terrible debacle of Dunkirk. So graduating from high school in June of 1940 was sort of an ominous date that, boy, oh boy, something is going to be happening here. Well, I didn't apply for any of the academies. I applied for admission to California Institute of Technology and was admitted there. And originally I thought I was going to go into chemistry because the nylon fabric, synthetic fabric, had just been commercialized. And boy, I thought, gee whiz, that's the thing that I ought to be studying more about this chemistry. Well, I found out that freshman chemistry was a lot different than high school chemistry, and quickly changed my field of interest to engineering, and particularly mechanical engineering. Well, then along comes 1941, December 7th. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and that was at the beginning of my sophomore year at Caltech. And I remember walking to church that Sunday morning, because it was around 8 o'clock Pacific Coast time when all this was going on at Pearl Harbor. And I saw a few people on the streets kind of gathered together talking. And well, I wonder what's going on. So when I got back to my rooming house around maybe 10, 11 o'clock, there my people who ran the rooming house informed me what really had been going on. So, well, it's on. And so the next day, December 8th, a Monday, 1941, was the day that President Roosevelt addressed Congress and the whole country by radio. And I remember being in one of our big lecture halls at Caltech when he gave his speech, a day which will live in infamy. And I noted one of the maintenance men in the back of the room with tears in his eyes. And I thought, gee whiz, what's going on? Well, obviously, he probably was a World War I veteran and knew what this meant. Well, we just continued on with our sophomore year. Of course, all kinds of things were happening in the Pacific, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then there was Doolittle's Raiders in, I guess, March of 42, and then the Battle of Midway in June-ish of 42, which was our first real successful endeavor, which did a good deal to pretty much slow down the Japanese aircraft carrier attacks. But I was still a civilian, although a lot of boys had enrolled in the Army with the somewhat implied promise that, yeah, we'll let you keep going to school until you get your degree, and then we'll send you to officer training. Well, unfortunately, that didn't happen for many of them. And, well, I just sort of treaded water here for a while, and luckily in early 43, I think by this time, volunteer enlistments in any service had been pretty much curtailed. You had to go through a draft board to get into the service. Well, of course, that wasn't hard to do. Draft boards were eager to get a hold of people. But the Navy did come up with a program, which they called the V-12 program, which said that, yes, you folks that are already in college, that are well into your programs, we will take you, and you will be enrolled in the Navy, but you will be on inactive duty until, I guess it was going to be early July 1943. At that time, we will be all organized, and we'll have these V-12 programs throughout colleges all over the country. So that's what really happened to me. Luckily, Caltech was one of the schools that was chosen to have a V-12 program. Stanford, unluckily for those boys, Stanford did not have a V-12 program, and a lot of their folks then were transferred that were engineering type people, such as I, were transferred down to Caltech. So my senior year at Caltech was one spent in the V-12 program, and that was really considered active duty as of July 1st, 1943. We were wearing uniforms, being paid, wearing apprentice seaman uniforms, which was kind of an oddball because you never saw apprentice seamen on the streets because those uniforms are only worn in boot camp. So if any apprentice seaman was seen on the public street, he probably was AWOL. So we were kind of a mixed breed there, and that proved to be quite awkward when we got our degrees in the end of mid-February 1944, got our bachelor's degrees from Caltech. Then I was assigned to the Reserve Officers Naval Midshipman School in New York City. And that was being conducted at Columbia University for the people who were deck officers, the boys that came from non-engineering schools. And the transportation by train from Pasadena, California, where Caltech was located, to New York, you know, you'd get off the train various places, and Shore Patrol would be there. The Navy Shore Patrol would be in the stations. They'd see somebody with an apprentice seaman uniform on, immediately come up, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Well, then you had to pull out your papers that showed, yeah, you're assigned, yes, you're legal. I'm assigned to go to the Midshipman School in New York City for reserve officers training. Oh, okay, I hadn't seen that before. So we finally get to New York in early March of 1944. And I don't know what people's impression of New York is today, but that was a wonderful place. New York City during World War II just was about the 4 months I spent there, March, April, May, and June of 1944, were fantastic months. The people in New York just couldn't do enough for servicemen. You could get into any play that was sold out in New York City, like not South Pacific, but
Oklahoma.
Yeah, Oklahoma, The Voice of the Turtle, Life with Father, any of those plays, you could get in and get standing room if nothing else. But you could be sure to get in and be able to see those. And after being used to motion picture theaters in Southern California, and only hearing about stage plays in New York, I was completely flabbergasted at the difference. Those theaters in New York were tiny. They weren't much bigger than this room that we're sitting in now. So even at standing room, you could practically count the teeth in the actors' mouths. So it's a fabulous experience. And people there just couldn't do enough for you. You could ride the subways any place for a nickel. And it was really about one of the most pleasant 4 months of my life. The sad thing, of course, during that period was D-Day, June 6, 1944, was the invasion of Normandy, which cost the lives of too many people. But, you know, that's not going to happen to me. You know, you're infallible when you're 21 years old. Nothing's going to happen to you. So we got our commissions as engineering type officers in the Naval Reserve. I think it was June 29th, 1944. And that was at the Church of St. John the Divine. And that in itself was quite an experience. But even prior to that, every Saturday, well, I should back up a moment here. Where did I really get my training? I said Columbia University. Well, that's where the deck officers went. The engineering officers were assigned to something called the Prairie State. That was the old original USS Battleship No. 7, I think it was the Illinois, that had been in the Spanish-American War. Well, the whole superstructure of that battleship had been site cleared, and what I would call Noah's Ark was built on top of it. Just a big old frame barn. And that housed our dormitory, our barracks, our classrooms, our mess hall, just about everything else. Only down in the bottom where there had been machinery, there still was some machinery where we could look at what sort of propulsion systems old battleships at one time had. So that's where we were. Well, that meant that there was a complete midshipman school review every Saturday morning where we would have to march from the Prairie State at 125th Street in the Hudson River to Columbia University, which was, oh goodness, maybe 1.5 miles south, inboard a little bit. But in the process of doing that, we would march down Riverside Drive, which sounds incredible. How could you possibly have marched down a main thoroughfare like that? Well, remember, this was World War II. There weren't that many automobiles running around with gas rationing, and even if there hadn't been gas rationing, there wouldn't have been too much traffic at that time. Anyway, it took us past Barnard College, which was the women's college equivalent for Columbia, because women were not admitted to Columbia either, as they were to a lot of schools in those days. So these Barnard girls were leaning out their windows, waving to us as we would be marching by. Quite a thrill. We would then finally get to Columbia, and then we would join the midshipmen from Columbia in a combined review by the commanding officer and all of his staff. Now, the commanding officer of the whole program there was a captain in the United States Navy. His exec, I think, was Naval Reserve, but the captain himself was USN. Well, and there would be a band playing, you know, to keep us in step. Well, unfortunately, the field where we did this was surrounded by high-rise classroom buildings. and the music would echo off of these buildings, and it was the easiest thing in the world to get out of step. So which one of these are we really following? So we sometimes get some pretty good strong glares from the reviewing officers, say, hey, get into step there. Anyway, it was a great experience. But finally that did come to an end, and we received our orders. And my orders said, well, you and about a half a dozen other officers, brand new ensigns, are going to be assigned to report to the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, well, wherever he may be, and for engineering duty. Well, that was fine. Well, we just assumed, well, that means we're going to be sent to Pearl Harbor. Well, okay. Oh, I should mention one thing. Once you got your commission, I think you were supposed to salute the first commissioned officer you met and probably even give him a dollar, something like that. I think that's what we did. I don't think he gave us a dollar. I think we had to give him a dollar. Anyway, we did finally get on a train and eventually wound up in San Francisco. And there we had very, very specific instructions as I read through my files. Well, this is where you're supposed to report first, and this is what you do then, do this and do that, and this is where you can buy this stuff, and this is this is where you get your housing temporarily. So really spent, well, I thought, gee, they're going to ship us right out of here, whammo, and well, no. Spent about got out there in early July of 1944. Well, remember what had happened by then. The Guadalcanal, the first real land operation that we had, took place in August 8th of 1942. Yes, 42. And that was quite an engagement, because this was driving the Japanese out of territory that they had pretty well got themselves a fixture in. So that had been going on. And then when that was finally secured, maybe after 6 months, of almost 1943, and all kinds of other invasions were going on. And of course this was all happening while I was in college and at midshipman school. But anyway, we finally got there, and we finally got orders, and I think it was about July 19th of 1944, something like that, assigned to an Army transport, of all things, to take us to Pearl Harbor. Well, okay, this is how it is, I guess. And the common kind of byword in those days in San Francisco was Golden Gate in 48, 4 years later, and that was really what people were thinking, gee whiz, this war is not going to be over very soon. Boy, if we're going to have to take every one of those godforsaken islands out there in the Western Pacific, this is going to take a while. And so Golden Gate in 48, that's what we felt we could look forward to. But 6 days later, this Army transport did come into Pearl Harbor, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There were airplanes flying all over. There was a big battleship steaming out of the harbor, Pearl Harbor, out to sea. I think some cruisers. And when we finally tied up at a pier, there were, I guess, Marine sentries or orderlies all over the place. And I said to myself, holy smokes, this is a place that the Japanese virtually destroyed a few years ago? The place is a beehive of activity now. How in the world could the Japanese ever expect it to win this war? And, well, that was just my impression. Well, as soon as we got there, then we had to report to the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet up at in Pearl Harbor. Well, of course, we did not meet Admiral Nimitz personally. We probably saw some ensign there who got us into a BOQ, Bachelor Officer's Quarter, and got a few other things straightened out. And so each day then we had to report to the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet for duty. Well, 2 or 3 days went by and still no duty. And then the word finally came out of what really was going on in Pearl Harbor. That President Roosevelt was there, and he was meeting with Admiral Nimitz. That's why Nimitz couldn't take time to talk to us. And General MacArthur was there too, and obviously they were discussing the forthcoming invasion of the Philippines, which certainly was had to be one of the linchpins of the eventual victory over Japan. So then all was revealed that this is why we had all of this show of force there, with Roosevelt himself being there. Well, finally then, after a few more days, Roosevelt did depart, and then things really settled down to a more or less routine sort of environment. But we still were reporting every day to the commander-in-chief or whoever was designated as his representative. And during one of those sessions, when this other ensign and I were walking up from our BOQ up the hill, up Macalapa Hill, I guess they called it, to the headquarters, lo and behold, as we were walking down the hill, approaching us comes some flag officer with the most weather-beaten face I had ever seen. Sunburned, wrinkled, and there were 2 Marine sentries walking behind him. Well, obviously whom we were meeting was Admiral Halsey. So we exchanged salutes, so that I guess would be one of the more memorable activities that I was involved in Pearl Harbor. But eventually, we finally were assigned a ship. And it was a ship that had been involved in all of these early landings in the Pacific. It was an attack transport. It was the USS President Hayes, and its designation was APA-20. Now, the history of that ship, I found, was very interesting. It was built in 1940, or at least it was, I guess, ordered in 1940 by the American President Lines, and I'm sure that the Maritime Commission probably forked over a lot of money to help build that ship so that they could get their hands on it if they needed it in a hurry. But it was built to be a round-the-world cargo passenger ship. And it had, if not luxury, extremely comfortable quarters for passengers. There was a very nice dining room on there with mirrors in it, pictures, multi-story high, probably 2 or 3 decks high in there. So it was really built to cater to a very well-traveled and rather comfortably fixed group of passengers. Well, the Navy, after the war in Europe had gone so terrible in 1940, 41, then took over that ship. The ship was built in Norfolk, Newport News, by the Newport News Shipbuilding Company. And the Navy took it over, and as soon as Pearl Harbor came, they started to convert it to an attack transport, which meant that it would be the type of ship that would take the Marines that were going to do the actual invasion ashore in these small landing craft that the big attack transport would carry, and then these 20 or maybe 2 dozen smaller LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, would actually take the troops ashore after they had climbed down these rope cargo nets that would be draped over the side of the ship. Well, that ship then had been involved in all of these earlier engagements that I mentioned, the Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Tulagi, you name it, and its sister ships. There was 2 other president ships, the President Adams, President Jackson, President Hayes. I think they were 18, 19, and 20. APA 18, 19, and ours was 20. There was a 4th ship, the Crescent City, but it was not a president, but it was designed to the same standards. These were all what they called C3 hulls, about 10,000-ton ships. By today's standards, that's a pretty small ship, but by 60 years ago, that was a pretty good-sized vessel. And these ships were all steam-powered. Fortunately for me, it was that they were steam-powered. They were steam turbine, steam boilers, of course. Single shaft, 2 boilers. And when the Merchant Marine was going to operate a ship like that, they would have probably operated that engine room with maybe 3 people down there. One person worried about the boilers, one person would stand the throttle watch, and then another person who would be at the switchboard. Now, this again is 1940, we're talking 60 years ago technology. And multi-speed motors in those days, you were pretty much locked into direct current motors. Today, you would not do that. Now you can even use alternating current motors and do various tricks with them to get variable speed out of them. And variable speed on a ship like this was extremely important for the various motors that operated the cranes and the winches, and all that sort of thing, where you had to be able to speed things up and slow things down very quickly, and that certainly applied to getting these landing craft off the ship and into the water. So that's what the type of machinery we had on board was this steam turbine driven ship with steam turbine direct current generators that operated in parallel. And so that's what I was assigned to. Now, why I say I'm fortunate, some poor devils were assigned to these awful LSTs that were diesel-powered ships that you would get seasick on if they were on the Ohio River. They were flat-bottomed, had no kind of a keel on them, so they must have been sheer unadulterated hell to have had to spend time on one of those. Fortunately, I was lucky not to have been assigned to one of those, probably because the Navy did not send me after midshipman school to a diesel school that they did have around the country. I think Cornell had a diesel school. And I guess they figured, well, if we're going to send you to a diesel ship, you ought to know something about diesel engines and how to fix them and keep them going. And I was lucky enough not to receive that sort of an assignment. So we get on this vessel in late August of 1944. And the word is, and of course, the way you learn something in the Navy was not from pieces of paper that were handed to you. You learned from the mess cooks. Right. If you really wanted to know what was going to happen next, you had to get close to the mess cooks, because they were the ones that heard everything. Everybody passed through the mess hall, and so the yeoman who worked up in the captain's office or the executive officer or the gunnery office, those people, they would be privy, or the radio shack, they would be privy to information that wouldn't be generally talked about. So the mess cooks heard all that, and they were just like hummingbirds. They would just repeat. And that's how you really learned where you were going to go, what was going to be happening next. So that's when we learned that, oh, okay, you're going to join this convoy, and you people are going to be taking Marines. They're going to be part of the invasion of the Philippines, Lady Gulf. Well, you don't just sail directly from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. At least we didn't. We sailed due west and wound up at some place called Eniwetok, joining more ships joining us as we went along to make one big convoy. And when we got there, I said, how did the navigators ever find this godforsaken place? There was about one palm tree growing out of a bunch of coral. And I don't know why, what we did there. There must have been tankers there to refuel us or something. Anyway, that's where we started from after we left Pearl. Well, then we finally headed south and stopped, oh goodness, I don't know how many places, but we finally then got to the Admiralty Islands, which are right off the north coast of New Guinea. And we stopped at a place called Manus. And that's where the real rendezvous of all the fighting ships that were going to escort us and the other transports, and there must have been at least 20 transports. There were 4 of our sister ship, but other types. And I need to preface my remarks here. The people, the crew that was on that ship, basically had been on that vessel ever since they left the States in January of '42. So we're talking about 2.5 years that these people had been roaming around the Pacific in this terrible climate, the heat and all that. And the ship had gone down then to Australia and New Zealand for temporary emergency repairs and that sort of thing. And boy, the sailors then got out of the tropics into some decent weather that was, you know, like temperate climate, almost like Long Beach, you might say. It was just wonderful climate, and some of those fellows said, gee, well, this is perfect down here. And of course, they would make friends with some of the local ladies down there. And a lot of them were made vows, and boy, you know, when this war is over, I'm going to go back down there to Wellington. That's a pretty nice girl down there. I think I might want to marry her and stay down there. And, well, I think a few of them did. I don't know if they stayed down there, but they did marry New Zealand and Australian girls. But anyway, that kind of sets the tone for the feeling on the ship. That here come a bunch of newcomers like myself, and new officers. And there have been a lot of other changes too. It turned out that I think there was even a change of captains. And this ship, the commanding officer really did rank a rank of captain. And so a new captain came aboard, Captain Soike. And that in itself didn't mean too much to me, because you rarely saw the captain in the engine room. Not that it didn't happen, but that it wasn't something that he would do on a daily basis. But fortunately for me, there was a enlisted person of some 25 years of service in the Navy who had come up through the ranks of chief and was now a warrant officer. Mm-hmm. And he was assigned to the engine room. At the same time, he came aboard in Pearl, about the same time that I was assigned to the ship. And he was a gruff old fellow. And he said, stick around with me, Soike. Be my shadow. I'll show you this engine room. I'll show you everything you need to know about it, what needs to be done, and what the care and feeding of these things. And you handle the paperwork up there in the office, but let me really handle the people down here. Okay, I'll be your shadow. And that really worked out well. I learned an awful lot from him. And so we set sail. We get to Manus, which was the kind of a rendezvous place. And I never saw so many ships at one place in my life, before or since. I couldn't believe my eyes hardly. From one horizon to the other, there were ships of all kinds, transports, cargo ships, battleships, escort carriers, not the real combat carriers. Those boys had more important things to do. But we had all kinds of escort carriers to protect us, and cruisers and destroyers. But on the way to that, there would be a daily target practice where one of the ships would send up sort of a scout plane towing a big canvas target behind it. And I think the word came around to transports like us. Now you guys just don't pay any attention to that. Let the destroyers work on those things. You've done your duty, and I should mention that by the time I got on that ship alone had shot down 7 Japanese planes. Mm. And, you know, and it's a case of do or it's going to be done to you, because there weren't that many escorts available. You had destroyer escorts, and maybe if you were lucky, you had an escort carrier to give you some air cover, but that didn't always happen. So the gunners on those ships really had become quite proficient at knocking down Zeros and hopefully even some Jap bombers, some Bettys. And I should mention another part of my career before this, that while I was in San Francisco waiting to get on a ship, I did attend a class in firefighting at Mare Island. That was an option, also something to take. Here's something you could do to kill your time here in San Francisco, go to this firefighting school. Well, I did that, and that was quite enlightening. These firefighters, they were of course all Navy people, but they were civilian firemen, so they really knew what they were doing. So they would have a simulated bilge, ship's bilge thing with oil in the water and machinery around, and then they would start a pretty good fire in there. And then you were supposed to go in there and put that out. Of course, they were with you. But you had all the protective gear, and you had the firefighting equipment, the foam, and the nozzles, and all that sort of stuff. And it really did take the fear of fire out of you. You could see that how, if you were properly equipped and had the right equipment, you could feel pretty comfortable attacking a fire on a ship at sea. So that was well worthwhile. And then at Pearl Harbor, while I was waiting to be assigned to the ship, there were some other classes you could go to, and one of them was aircraft recognition. And I said, well, gee, that'd be kind of fun to do. You know, I think I know quite a bit of recognizing airplanes. Growing up in Southern California during the war, I was used to seeing P-38s flying overhead all the time. And March Field wasn't too far away, and so there'd be the boys that were training there for flight training while I was still in college would be flying over. But it was a whole new ball game when you got out there and somebody's flashing for about 1 second, this airplane, this one. Well, I found out the enlisted boys in that class were whizzes at it. They could identify all these different things. I don't think they had German planes in there, but they had all the Japanese planes and all of ours that you were likely to see out there in the Pacific. But those guys were fantastic, and I had a terrible time trying to remember all of those with that split-second decision-making you had to do. So those were the guys that were shooting down these Jap planes, people that had gone through all of this and that had pretty good training in that. So, where are we? Well, we're about to make the landing at Leyte. And so we do steam in there. And it was October 20th, 1944. That is October 20th out in the Western Hemisphere. And we did not have Marines. This time, this was going to be an Army operation. Prior to that, the Marines had been involved in all of these early landings. And that meant that there was a Marine colonel or equivalent on board. And he, I forget what his title was, I guess, but in effect, when our transports came to a place, our captain would anchor it, but this Marine would take charge of the unloading of the ship and the loading of the troops, his Marine group, into the boats and ordering those boats to go ashore. That was his job. He had a yeoman to keep track of all of his paperwork too. But so that was a pretty responsible job that this Marine had. But this time at Leyte, it was an Army operation. And the troops that we had were not the first ones that went ashore. We had a contingent of Army engineers that they were going to be there to help build roads and build airstrips and all that, or repair airstrips like at what became Henderson Field. And so they did not leave the ship right away. They were not in the first wave of invaders. So these fellows had to bide their time, probably. It probably was terrible having to wait around and not know what was going to be happening for them. But that's what they had to do. And in the meantime, there was very little Japanese air involvement, although there was one that snuck in past and did torpedo one of our ships. one of the combat vessels. I think it was a cruiser. The Honolulu, I think it was. So they were still crawling around and could cause all kinds of trouble. But our ship was not attacked. And I can just jump ahead. It never was damaged by enemy action. There were some times when some explosions occurred nearby that may have jostled the electric system and the lights temporarily went out, but we were never struck by any enemy shells or torpedoes, although apparently there were some close calls earlier, long before I got on the ship. Well, eventually our troops did get off the ship and went ashore about 5 days after. And while this was going on, I guess was one of the, when I said that the big carriers weren't with us because they had more important things to do, they were getting involved in the Battle of the Philippine Sea under Halsey's command. So that was going on, but you know, we didn't know anything about it except what we might have gotten on through the mess cooks, something like that. Finally, then we left, and we were going back to Manus to, I guess, regroup and go back to Pearl, I guess it was. Anyway, we got back to Manus, and this was maybe 6 or 7 days after the initial landing at Lady Gulf, and we were getting all set to take off the next morning, but before that we'd had some, you're always doing drills on a ship. Away the fire and rescue party, away this party, away that one to do, oh, there's a fire zone, so take care of this. Well, there was a drill the day before for, I guess, the fire and rescue party, and as an attack transport, we had 4 medical doctors on board. Probably a lot more than even the big combat vessels, because they were expected that they could anticipate getting all kinds of wounded being brought ashore, but being brought aboard the vessel. So we had 4 of those medical people there. And in fact, we even had a dentist as well. And they had been rehearsing what they would have to do if they had to board a vessel that was you know, in trouble, on fire, or there'd been a lot of damage. And wouldn't you know it, then here this morning when we were about to get underway, I was down in the engine room. That wasn't my normal general quarters. That's general quarters is the battle station where people were to go whenever combat was expected. My normal general quarters place was not in the engine room, surprisingly. It was some other place. But so that morning we weren't at general quarters, so I was in the engine room, and Jascola was there with me. Now I should mention that Jascola had come from an escort carrier, and so he'd been in a lot of action, so he knew what explosions were like and what it could mean. And all of a sudden we heard this huge boom, and our ship just shook. And he instantly said, "We've been hit." And I didn't know what, you know, I couldn't contradict him or anything. Well, okay, Jazz says we've been hit. We must have been hit. Well, it turned out that we weren't hit. But this was a real disaster of major proportions. The ammunition ship Mount Hood was in the same harbor at Manus, and it exploded. And apparently everybody on that vessel was killed. There were about 390 officers and men, and none of them survived. And they found stuff all over the harbor when that ammunition ship exploded. Why it exploded, I don't think has ever been known. I don't think it was enemy activity. But so there wasn't anything for our people to do. There wasn't any ship there to go to. But there was one nearby that had been severely damaged by the explosion of the Hood. And so they went on board that ship, and there they said the corridors were just flowing with blood, so they had plenty to do. They really earned their pay that day, so trying to save as many people as they could who were badly injured in the explosion on the nearby Hood. So that delayed our departure going back to Pearl Harbor for, I guess, another day or so while that was being sort of cleaned up. So we did go back to Pearl, and the good news that the mess cooks then had is, hey, we're finally going to go back to the States. Our sister ships had been sent back maybe a year earlier for extensive overhaul and repair, but the Hayes had been out there all this time, ever since January of '42. Now we're October of '44, almost 3 years later. Finally, we're going to go back to the States. Well, wait, great. Well, we first go through Pearl, and then we got back to the States, and then went over a shipyard in Oakland for about a 3-week overhaul, and getting a lot of ship alteration things that my wife's people were the assistant industrial managers, the people we had to plead to get these things done. And there never was such a person as the industrial manager in my judgment. It was always the assistant industrial manager that you had to plead your case to get these things done, even though they were authorized to be done by the Bureau of Ships. It says that you are entitled to have this sort of thing done on your ship. Well, if the assistant industrial manager said, I don't have facilities to do that, I don't have the money for it, I don't have the time for it, well, it didn't get done. And then there was no recourse to that. Well, anyway, we finally did get enough stuff completed so that we could finally leave San Francisco and proceed to the South Pacific again. I forget what sort of troops. I don't know that we had troops. I think we just carried things like toilet paper and stuff, all kinds of supplies out of the States down to Australia, where we were going to pick up troops to do more work in the Philippines, like going up near Manila and straightening that part out. So all I remember is that en route we would stop at places that were garden spots compared to the rest of the Pacific, like Noumea, New Caledonia, and that to me was kind of that's a French island, and it was pretty primitive back in the war days, but we have been back there since on cruise ships, and Noumea is a much nicer place today. But it had an officers' club, and so people could go there. And I know we stopped at Noumea, and then we stopped at Brisbane. And my observation of Brisbane, Australia, and you must recall that when MacArthur left the Philippines right after Pearl Harbor, and he was ordered to get out of the Philippines so he wouldn't be captured, they went to Australia, and I guess in a PT boat, and I think they wound up that MacArthur's in Brisbane, although they probably weren't there this late. Anyway, we got to Brisbane, and I went ashore in Brisbane, and my recollection of Brisbane in that would have been 1945. Wow, this is like going to Cheyenne, Wyoming, maybe 20 years ago. It was like a cow town. They had some kind of a vaudeville show there that I went to, and it was so corny by my standards. How in the world? But the people in Brisbane were just delighted to see something like this, because I guess they'd been under, a lot of fear. That was the big fear in Australia, was the Japs were going to. That was the Battle of Coral Sea was the one that sort of took that idea out of their head of invading Australia. But still, the Australian people were pretty gun-shy about the war. And so anything like this that would distract from their rather poor living standards was a big blessing to them. I remember I didn't have any Australian money, and I got on a streetcar, and today we wouldn't think anything of it, but it was a young lady was the conductor. Well, that was unprecedented. I would see a young lady as a conductor on a streetcar. And I gave her an American dollar, and she looked at it, and, oh, that's an American dollar, isn't it? Oh, yes, it is. And I said, I don't have any Australian money. And I don't know how that transaction ended, but anyway, I got to go where I wanted to go. So that was my first impression of Brisbane. I understand today that it is really a great metropolitan area with a lot of manufacturing and business activities going on, but that isn't how it was in 1945. Wow, where are we? Let's see, chronologically. Oh.
Well, did you pick up troops and head back to the Philippines?
Yes, we did. Yeah, thank you, thank you. Yes, we did pick up troops, and we went to Manila, which by that time we had secured. Manila was in American hands. And again, it was disappointing to see how badly Manila was damaged, and I guess it was really by our own bombers trying to drive the Japanese out of there, but the Manila was pretty well beaten up. And one of the goofy assignments I had was to take charge of a small shore patrol group to make sure that our sailors behaved themselves when they were ashore. And you have to appreciate that when a ship is at sea, everything is fine. People are healthy, they don't get sick, they can't get into trouble, they don't get drunk. But boy, once you get tied up to a dock and the sailors can get off, then anything can happen, and usually does. And so the poor guys are going to get into trouble one way or another. And so I was in charge of this group to help out whatever military police there were around. Fortunately, I don't recall that we did find any of our people that needed to be escorted back to the ship. But that, and I think I did that on one other occasion. And much to my amazement, I remember when we were walking on the street, a trio of Army nurses was passing in the other direction. And I guess we sort of nodded to each other as we walked by. But that was it. And some 30 years later, Margaret and I were on a cruise someplace. And here some lady came up, and it came out that she had been a nurse, an Army nurse during World War II, and she had been in Manila. And she said, addressed me, "Were you in the Navy at Manila?" And I said, "Yes, I was. At one time, not long, but I was there in Manila." And it turned out that she had to be one of those three that passed on the street. Small world, small world. We then, when we pulled out of Manila with this troop...
Had there been there was no Japanese opposition
No,
that you saw at that time?
No, it was all cleaned out by then at that point, yeah. Then we went up to Lingayen Gulf, which was further north, and I guess I don't know what we were doing there, but it was kind of polluted water where all these ships were tied up, or not tied up, but anchored. And I know the medical officers got really concerned about it and started to put chlorine in the drinking water. Of course, we made our own drinking, well, normally you made your own drinking water, but even so, I think they felt, gee, this water is so polluted that even after you distill it here, I don't know how good that's going to be, so we're going to load you up with chlorine here to make sure. Well, they were successful. I don't think anybody got sick up there. And then what did we do from there? I guess we did take troops someplace, but yes, I think this is what happened. Of course, when you come down to August 5th of 45, that's when the atomic bomb was dropped over Hiroshima, and in effect that ended the war. And
were you getting ready to go to Japan at that point?
Yes, I think we were, and I think we were, but I don't think that the type of people we had were expected to be invasion troops. They were going to be occupying troops. Yeah. And I think we may have picked them up at Lingayen Gulf or something. But certainly a lot of people were leaving the States that thought they were going to be part of the invasion, but I don't think our vessel was going to be involved in that. So it's interesting when we did get to Japan in a convoy, and the war was over. Both atomic bombs had been dropped and the Japanese had surrendered. When we come into this port, of course, we didn't have any really good charts in that port. At least one that anyone that you could trust, was you didn't know what the Japanese may have done during the war. So we had Japanese pilots on board the ship. Old men, you know, gray-haired men that were civilians, but they, of course, knew where any mines had been placed and anything like that that we needed to avoid that hadn't been swept out already. But that was really funny to see them up on the bridge, and then everybody was looking down to see these gray-haired, elderly Japanese civilians down there telling us where the ship could go. Gosh, crazy. I've kind of jumped ahead a little bit here. As it turned out, amazingly enough, the day the war was officially over in August, my ship was back in my hometown port of Long Beach, California, anchored there. We were supposed to have gone to San Francisco, but for some reason, when we got near San Francisco, I said, no, you're going to go anchor down in Long Beach, my home port. So my mother was thoroughly surprised when she gets a phone call from me when I got off the ship. No, I don't even think she'd had a phone, so that she had to see me personally, I guess. Phones were hard to come by, it's hard to believe, but she didn't even have a phone.
Stop for a minute.
My experiences in the Navy were so positive. I had no bad experiences at all. I did not suffer physically from anything, mentally, psychologically, or emotionally. I was very fortunate. As a matter of fact, I liked the Navy so much I applied for a transfer to the regular Navy and was granted that, but I tried to attach some strings to it that I only wanted engineering duty. And the Navy came back, it's too late for that. If you want to do that, you first must come in as a regular line officer, and then after you've proven yourself there, then you can apply for engineering duty only. And I said, well, thanks, but no thanks. I think my future is best in the civilian life. So we said goodbye. And I left and was discharged to inactive service in like January 3rd of 1947. And my Navy experience really led right into my employment with Procter & Gamble here in Cincinnati. I was lucky enough to join the department in engineering at P&G that had to do with boilers and turbines and that sort of thing. So it was an experience that was very invaluable to me. So in effect, you might say that my Navy experience isn't so much what I did for the Navy, although there were moments when I think I certainly earned my keep. But it's more of what the Navy has done for me. They, as I said, they financed my senior year at Caltech in the V-12 program. They financed my master's degree program at Caltech after the war. One crazy incident, I guess if I've got a minute left here, you know, it's hard to imagine anybody stowing away on a Navy ship. Usually it's the other way around. It's people that don't want to go someplace. But in San Francisco, I guess sometime in mid-1946, and it was not too difficult to get on a Navy ship. Before the war, in fact, the Navy even encouraged civilians to go aboard these vessels out in Long Beach. They ran boats out there. But this is now long after that. But somehow, these two girls had met some sailor on our ship who apparently had pretty good financial background. And he was being transferred to Pearl Harbor. And gee whiz, they said to themselves, gee, here this guy with all this money is going to be out in Pearl, and gee, we've had a good time here in San Francisco. Maybe we should see if we can't go out there. We'd certainly find something to do out there. So here they got on board the ship, and the ship sails. and we're out maybe 2 hours at sea. And the engineering office is down the same corridor where the Navy nurses had their 2 Navy nurses on board, because now we were what they called,
Magic carpet.
what do you call it?
Dependents.
Yeah, but what do we call it? Magic carpet.
Oh.
We were magic carpeting. We were taking people back and forth. People that were being discharged from the Navy were brought back to the States. Families that were going to meet their husbands who were still overseas, and now families were allowed to travel, would be on there. So that meant they had to have Navy nurses on board. Well, I was just coming out of the engineer's office, walking down this corridor. All of a sudden, these 2 babes come out of this one room, and they said, "Oh, we're not supposed to be here." And the older of the Navy nurses, probably an older one, about 35 years old, said, dumbfounded. Her jaw just dropped. And so she immediately took them up to the executive officer. So they were going to be, in effect, under house arrest. But that was probably the most bizarre thing that ever happened.
But they got the pearl before they got...
That's right. We didn't turn around. No, we weren't going to turn around and do that. They were going to have to... They were going to get the pearl, but not under the same circumstances that they envisioned.
Okay, Dick, I think we're about done, so thank you so much for sharing your experiences with the oral history program.